I spent 3 months planning a party for a man who stood in front of 200 people and told them I was not really his daughter. I booked the venue. I paid the deposit. I stayed up past midnight making sure every detail was right because I wanted him to feel proud, and somewhere deep down, I still wanted him to see me. He saw me that night. He looked right at me when he said it, and the room went so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I had given 32 years of my life trying to earn something from this man that he had apparently already decided I did not deserve. But what he did not know, what none of them knew, was that my husband Marcus had arrived at that party carrying something in his jacket pocket. Something that was about to make my father's words the most expensive thing he ever said out loud. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honest. If the person you spent your whole life trying to make proud stood up in public and told everyone you were not really theirs, what would you do in that moment? Would you walk out? Would you stay silent? Would you fall apart? Or would you finally let the truth do what you never had the courage to do yourself? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything, and I think by the end of this, you will understand exactly why Lousia did not say a single word that night. My name is Lousia, and I am going to tell you about the night I stopped being a daughter and started being free. I grew up believing that love was something you earned, not something you were given at birth, not something that came with the family name, but something you had to work for, prove yourself worthy of, and keep earning no matter how many years passed. My father, Gerald, was a tall, quiet man who ran his life like a business. He was not cruel in the way that people imagine when they hear the word cruel. He did not yell much. He did not throw things. He simply withheld. He withheld warmth. He withheld praise. He withheld the small moments that children remember forever, the ones that make them feel like they belong somewhere in this world. I was the oldest of 3 children. My brother Damien was born 2 years after me, and my sister Priya came 4 years after that. From the time I was old enough to understand dynamics, I could feel the difference in how my father moved around each of us. With Damien, he was patient. With Priya, he was soft. With me, he was careful. Not careful the way you are with something fragile. Careful the way you are with something that does not quite belong to you but ended up in your hands anyway. My mother, Elaine, was a warm and busy woman who worked as a school nurse and spent her weekends driving us to activities and making sure the house stayed together. She never talked much about the early years of her marriage to Gerald. She never talked about the first year before I was born, or what their relationship had been like before children arrived. She was one of those women who kept her private pain folded up and stored somewhere no one else could reach it. I loved her for 100 reasons, and I also spent years being frustrated by her silence on the things that mattered most. I was a good student. I worked hard because working hard was the only thing that ever got Gerald to look at me with something close to satisfaction. Not pride, exactly. More like approval. The kind of look a supervisor gives a reliable employee. I graduated near the top of my class. I got into a good university without asking anyone for financial help because I had spent 2 summers working and had earned a partial scholarship on top of that. Gerald nodded when I told him. Just nodded. Then he asked Damien how his football tryouts had gone. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that some people were simply not built for emotional expression and that Gerald loved me in his own quiet way. I held onto that story for a very long time. I met Marcus when I was 24. He was working as a structural engineer, and I had just started my 2nd year managing a small event planning company that I had built from nothing after deciding that working for someone else felt like wearing a coat that did not fit. Marcus was the kind of man who noticed things. He noticed when I went quiet at family dinners. He noticed when I came home from visits to my father's house, looking like something had been taken from me even when nothing had been said. He would not push me to talk. He would just make tea and sit next to me and wait, and eventually I would start talking, and he would listen the way very few people ever actually listened, which is to say he listened with his full attention and without preparing his response while I was still speaking. We got married 3 years after we met. It was a simple wedding. My parents came. My siblings came. Gerald sat in the front row and looked appropriate. He gave a toast at the reception that was technically about me but somehow managed to be mostly about himself and the importance of hard work and responsibility. Marcus's parents cried. My mother cried. Gerald did not cry. He held his glass and smiled at the right moments and then ate his dinner. Years after that were full in the way that lives get full when you are building something. Marcus and I bought a modest house that needed work, and we did much of the work ourselves on weekends. I grew my event planning business steadily. Not fast, but real. I hired 2 full-time staff and several part-time contractors. I had a client list I was genuinely proud of. I planned corporate events, private celebrations, charity fundraisers, and the occasional large wedding. I was good at my work. I understood that the emotional detail of an event was what people actually remembered, not the flowers or the catering, but whether the room felt right, whether the people felt seen, whether the whole experience carried meaning. Gerald retired at 68 after nearly 4 decades working as a senior accountant for a manufacturing firm. When the family started talking about doing something to celebrate, my mother pulled me aside first. Not Damien, not Priya, me. She said she wanted the party to be special and she wanted it handled by someone who truly cared. I said yes immediately. Of course I said yes, because that is what I did. I showed up. I handled things. I cared about the details, even when no one thanked me for caring. I spent 3 months on that retirement party. I booked a venue that could hold 200 guests, because Gerald knew a lot of people from his decades of work, and my mother wanted his colleagues and friends to all be there. I coordinated catering, a live band, decorations that reflected Gerald's measured but dignified personality, a custom photo display running through his career, a personal tribute video that I put together by collecting photos and short recorded messages from colleagues, old friends, and family members. I handled every invoice, every vendor call, every timeline. I wrote the opening welcome remarks. I arranged the seating so that Gerald would feel honored at every moment of the evening. Marcus helped me carry boxes to the venue on the setup day. He helped me string lights and test the microphone and make sure the photo display loaded properly. He watched me work for hours with the kind of quiet admiration that I had come to understand as one of his deepest forms of love. At one point, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You are doing so much for a man who does not deserve half of it." I told him not to start. He did not push it. But he held his thoughts the way he held everything, quietly and carefully. And I should have known even then that he was carrying something I did not know about yet. The night of the party was beautiful in the way that only events can be beautiful when someone has truly paid attention to every detail. The venue glowed warmly. The photo display looped through decades of Gerald's working life, and the guests gathered around it with drinks in their hands and genuine smiles on their faces. The catering was perfect. The band played exactly the kind of understated, classy music my father preferred. My mother wore a pale blue dress and looked happier than I had seen her look in years. Damien and Priya arrived with their families and immediately started accepting compliments for the event as though they had contributed more than just their attendance. I was moving through the room making sure everything was running smoothly when one of Gerald's oldest colleagues, a man named Herbert who had worked with my father for over 20 years, stopped me and said he had heard that I organized the whole evening. I told him yes, that I had. He shook my hand warmly and said that Gerald must be incredibly proud of me. I smiled and thanked him and moved on quickly because something about that sentence, the words "must be incredibly proud," struck me in a place I did not want to examine right then. The tribute portion of the evening arrived. The band quieted. The room gathered. My mother stood beside Gerald near the front of the room, and I had arranged for several speakers to say a few words before Gerald himself addressed the room. Colleagues spoke. Old friends spoke. Damien spoke, and he told a funny story about Gerald teaching him to fish that made the room laugh warmly. Priya spoke and cried a little, which made the room awe, and Gerald put his arm around her in a way that he had never once put his arm around me at any public moment in my entire life. Then it was Gerald's turn at the microphone. He was a composed speaker. He had spoken at industry events for years and he knew how to hold a room. He thanked his colleagues. He thanked his firm. He thanked his wife in a sentence that was elegant and made my mother press her hand to her heart. He thanked Damien. He thanked Priya. Then he looked across the room and his eyes flew. And me, and for one moment I felt the oldest hope I had ever carried rise up in my chest. The hope that this would be the moment. This would finally be the moment he said it, that he saw me, that he was proud of me, that I was his. He said my name, and then he said something else. He said that Lousia had always been a hard worker, and he appreciated what she had done with the event tonight. And then he said, with a small and almost casual smile, that of course Lousia was not really his by blood, but that had never stopped her from being useful to this family. Not really his by blood. Not really his. In a room of 200 people, with the lights warm and the music just ended, and every face turned toward us, my father said out loud that I was not really his daughter. The room did not immediately understand what they had heard. There was a half-second pause before the awkward murmurs started. I saw Herbert's face change. I saw two of my mother's friends exchange a glance. I saw Priya look at the floor and Damien look at the ceiling, and neither of them look at me. I stood in the middle of that room in the dress I had carefully chosen for this evening, and I felt something shift inside me that I cannot describe in a single word. It was not just hurt. Hurt implies surprise. This was something more like the moment when you have been holding your breath underwater for so long that your body simply stops pretending it can hold on. I did not cry. I want to tell you that now so you understand who Lousia is. I did not cry. I did not leave the room. I did not make a scene. I stood in that room and I breathed and I let Gerald finish his remarks and I watched the polite applause and I felt my husband's hand find mine in the crowd. Marcus had moved through the guests and found me in under 30 seconds, and he held my hand with the specific kind of grip that communicates everything without a single word, which was, I am here. I know, you are not alone. After the speech, people were unsure how to react. Some guests approached my father to congratulate him, and the evening tried to resume its warmth, but there was a shift in the room's energy that no amount of good food or careful lighting could repair. Several people came to me with that careful expression people wear when they want to acknowledge something painful without naming it directly. Herbert came to me and took both of my hands and looked at me and said simply, "That was wrong." I thanked him and moved on because I was still running the event, because that is what I did. I kept things running. Gerald did not come to me after his speech. Priya came to me near the end of the evening and said, in a low voice that she probably thought was comforting, that Dad had probably just had too much wine, and that I should not take it personally. I looked at her and said nothing because I understood in that moment that Priya had known something for a long time, and the fact that she thought I should not take it personally told me more than she realized. Damien avoided me entirely for the rest of the night. My mother found me near the cake and held my face in both hands and looked at me with an expression I will never forget, which was not shock, but grief, which told me that she had been carrying something heavy for 32 years, and tonight it had finally fallen in public. Marcus and I did not talk about it on the drive home. He drove and I looked out the window at the dark streets and let myself feel the full weight of the evening without trying to analyze it yet. When we got home, he made tea and we sat at the kitchen table and he put something on the table between us. It was an envelope. A plain white envelope that looked like it had been handled several times, carefully refolded, carefully protected. I looked at the envelope, and then I looked at him. He said he had received it 4 weeks ago. He said he had been trying to decide how and when to tell me, and that he had been waiting for the right moment, and then tonight happened, and he understood that the right moment was now. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from a woman I had never heard of, and attached to the letter were documents: a birth certificate, a DNA test result, a handwritten note, and a copy of a legal agreement that had been signed 33 years ago, 1 year before my mother married Gerald. I read every page slowly. Marcus sat across from me and did not rush me and did not speak. The kitchen was very quiet. The letter was from a woman named Caroline. She had been a close friend of my mother's before I was born. The letter explained that Caroline had carried this information for over 3 decades, and that her own health had begun to decline, and she could not leave this world without making sure I knew the truth, not because she wanted to cause pain, but because she believed I deserved to understand why my life had felt the way it had felt. My biological father was not Gerald. My biological father. There was a man named Thomas, who had been my mother's boyfriend for 2 years before Gerald. Thomas and my mother had parted ways just before my mother discovered she was pregnant. She had reached out to Thomas and told him. And Thomas, who had already begun building a life elsewhere, had signed a legal agreement acknowledging paternity but waiving parental rights in exchange for a private financial settlement from my maternal grandfather, who had wanted the matter handled quietly and without public complication. My mother had then started seeing Gerald shortly after, and when Gerald agreed to marry her knowing she was pregnant, the understanding was that the child, which was me, would carry Gerald's name and be raised in the family. There was no formal adoption. There was only a private agreement and 33 years of silence. Gerald had always known I was not his biological child. He had known from before I was born. And he had held that knowledge in his chest for 32 years and managed it in the way that he managed everything, by maintaining a careful emotional distance that he could point to as his personality while quietly making sure I always felt it. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Marcus refilled the tea at some point and I did not notice. I went through the documents twice. The DNA test was not one done on me directly. Caroline had included documentation from a test done between a biological sample she had preserved from Thomas and a sample provided by one of Thomas's other children, a half-sibling I had never known I had, which confirmed the line. She had included as much documentation as she could to show that this was not rumor or accusation, but recorded fact. I thought about 32 years. I thought about every school report I brought home and placed on the counter hoping Gerald would look at it. I thought about the day I graduated and Gerald nodded. I thought about my wedding and his toast about hard work. I thought about every holiday and every family dinner and every quiet room where I sat next to a man who had known from the beginning that I was not going to get what I was hoping for, because he had decided before I could even speak that I was in a separate category. And I thought about tonight. I thought about how he had stood in front of 200 people and said I was not really his by blood. And I thought about the word useful. He had called me useful. I looked at Marcus, and I asked him why he had not told me before the party. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had been afraid of what it would do to me before a night that was already full of emotional weight, and that he had also needed time himself to process the anger he had felt when he read the documents, because Marcus was not a man who acted from anger, and he had needed to make sure that when he brought this to me, he was steady enough to be what I needed him to be. I understood that. I also understood that Marcus had come to the party that evening with those documents in his jacket pocket, not to create a scene, but because he had sensed that something might happen and he had wanted to be prepared to respond to whatever came. He told me that he had shown the documents to no one. He told me that what happened next was entirely my decision and that he would support any choice I made, including the choice to do nothing at all. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay in the dark and let the shape of my life rearrange itself around this new information. The hurt was not simple. It came in layers. The first layer was the betrayal of my mother, who had kept this from me for my entire life, and who I now understood had been carrying guilt and fear and probably love in a complicated tangle that I could not yet fully feel compassion for. The second layer was Gerald, and what he had done with what he knew, which was not nothing, because ignorance is not a choice but deciding how to treat a child you are raising absolutely is. The third layer was the night, the party, the microphone, the 200 people, the word useful. And somewhere underneath all of those layers was a fourth layer that I had not expected, and that was something that felt, against all logic, almost like relief. Because if Gerald's distance had never been truly about me, if his coldness had never been a verdict on my worth, if he had simply been a man incapable of fully loving a child he had not chosen in his heart, then the story I had told myself for 32 years, which was that I was not quite enough, was not the truth. The truth was that I had been given an impossible situation from the start, and I had done everything right inside of it. And that did not fix the pain, but it changed the shape of it. The next morning, I called my mother before she could call me. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear immediately that she had not slept either. I told her that I needed to see her. She said she would come to M. I said I preferred to come to her, because I wanted Gerald out of the house when we spoke. She understood without me saying more, and she told me to come at 10, and that Gerald had a morning appointment. I drove to my childhood home and walked in through the front door I had walked through 1,000 times and sat at the kitchen table across from my mother and placed the envelope on the table between us, the way Marcus had placed it between us the night before. My mother looked at the envelope, and then she looked at me, and something in her face broke open that had clearly been sealed for a very long time. She did not ask me where I got it. She did not deny it. She pressed her hand flat on the table beside the envelope, and she looked at me and said my name, and then she started to cry. Not the polite, managed crying of someone performing emotion. The other kind. The kind that has been stored somewhere very deep and has finally been given a door. She talked for almost 2 hours. I let her talk. I asked questions when I needed to, and I kept my voice steady because I had come to understand, I think, that losing my temper in this room would not give me the clarity I was looking for. What I was looking for was the truth, not the performance of the truth, and the only way to get it was to keep the space between us calm enough that she could actually say what had happened. She told me about Thomas. She told me about the pregnancy and the fear she had felt and the pressure from her own parents to handle the situation quietly. She told me about Gerald, who she had genuinely loved, and how his offer to marry her and raise the child had felt like rescue at the time, but that the rescue had come with a quiet condition she had not fully understood until after the wedding. Gerald would raise the child. He would give the child his name. But he would never be able to fully give the child his heart, and he had told my mother this honestly, at least in private, in the early months of their marriage. He had told her that he was doing the right thing, but that he was not capable of pretending that right thing felt the same as choosing it. My mother had believed that over time this would change. Over time, it had not. She said she had tried to protect me by not telling me. She said she had believed that what I did not know could not hurt me, and that knowing would only have caused me pain without giving me anything useful in return. She said she was sorry. She said it more than once, and she meant it more than once, but the word sorry was doing a great deal of heavy lifting, and we both knew it. I told her I understood some of what she had done and why. I also told her that 32 years of silence had cost me something I could not name precisely, but could absolutely feel, which was the opportunity to understand my own life while I was living it. I told her that Gerald standing at that microphone the previous night and saying those words to 200 people was not something I was going to simply absorb and file away. I told her I needed time. She nodded. She looked older than she had looked the evening before, which I had not thought was possible. Before I left, she asked me what I planned to do. I told her I did not know yet. She asked if I was going to confront Gerald. I told her I would handle this the way I handled everything, carefully and on my own timeline. The following week was strange. Word had traveled from the party, as word always travels. Several of my mother's friends had been in that room, and while no one was broadcasting the story, there was the quiet circulation of what happened, that Gerald had said something troubling at his retirement party, that something about Lousia's situation had been raised, that there was more to the story. My phone got messages from people I had not spoken to in months. A few were checking in with genuine kindness. A couple were fishing for information under the cover of concern. I answered the kind ones briefly and left the fishing ones unread. Damien called me on a Wednesday. He said he thought we should talk. I asked him what he wanted to talk about. He said he thought maybe I was taking the whole party thing too hard, and that Dad was getting older, and sometimes older people said things without fully thinking. I asked Damien directly whether he had known, before the party, before the speech, before any of this, that Gerald was not my biological father. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed before he said anything at all. He said it was complicated. I told him I understood that it was complicated. I also told him that complicated was not the same as acceptable and that I appreciated his call and would be in touch, and I ended the conversation. Priya called the same day, which suggested the two of them had coordinated. Priya's approach was softer. She said she loved me, and she hoped I was okay, and she just wanted me to know that the family was worried about me, and that they hoped I was not going to do anything that would blow everything up. I asked her what she meant by blowing everything up. She said she just meant that these kinds of things, family history things, were better kept private. I asked her if she had thought about what keeping things private had already cost me. She did not have a good answer. I told her the same thing I told Damien, that I appreciated her call and would be in touch, and I ended the conversation. That same week, Marcus did something quietly that I found out about later. He consulted with a family law attorney. Not to initiate anything, not to file anything. Simply to understand the landscape, what the documents meant, what my legal position was with respect to any inheritance or estate matters related to Gerald, and what options existed. The attorney told him several things that were useful, one of which was relevant to a conversation that was coming faster than any of us expected. Gerald's mother, my grandmother Vera, who was 81 years old and had been in declining health for the past 2 years, passed away 9 days after the retirement party. She had been living in assisted care, and her decline had been gradual. Her death was not a shock, but it arrived with the particular weight that deaths always carry when they happen inside an already cracked family. Vera had a small but meaningful estate, a house that had been in the family for 50 years, some savings, personal belongings of sentimental and some moderate financial value. She had updated her will 2 years earlier when her health had declined. I was in Vera's will. I was listed by name, not by a large amount, but by name, specifically and deliberately. Vera had always treated me the same as the others. She had been the one adult in my extended family who had never made me feel like I occupied a separate category. She had called me on my birthdays until her memory made that difficult. She had sent me cards. She had said, more than once over the years, that she hoped I knew how proud she was of me. I had always believed her. Sitting with that belief now, I understood that Vera had probably known the truth for a long time and had chosen to love me with full intention anyway, which was the precise opposite of what Gerald had chosen. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after Vera's passing. Gerald attended with my mother. Damien attended. Priya attended. I attended with Marcus beside me, which I had specifically decided on because I did not want to sit in that room without someone who was fully on my side. When my name was read in the will, I felt Gerald's eyes move to me from across the room. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the attorney and listened. Vera had left me a personal letter as well, which was delivered to me separately from the official documents. I read it alone that evening. The letter was not long. Vera's handwriting was careful and slightly uneven, the way handwriting gets when someone is writing something important while managing physical difficulty. She wrote that she had known from very early in my life what the situation was and what Gerald's limitations were. She wrote that she had chosen to love me the way she believed a grandmother should love a grandchild, which was completely, without condition and without reservation, because I had done nothing to deserve anything less. She wrote that she was sorry she had not said more to Gerald over the years. She wrote that she hoped the small amount she was leaving me would represent what she had always meant to communicate, which was that I belonged. I was hers. Regardless of biology, regardless of paperwork, regardless of anything Gerald had ever said or decided, I was hers. I held that letter for a very long time. In the 2 weeks following the will reading, something shifted in Gerald's behavior. He had learned from the attorney in private that I was named in the will. He had also become aware, through the slow movement of family information, that Marcus and I had spoken to someone with knowledge of legal matters related to the family. Gerald was a man who had spent his entire career managing numbers and managing consequences. He understood when something had changed in the landscape. He called me himself, not through my mother, not through Damien or Priya. He called me directly on a Thursday morning and asked if we could have lunch. I told him I would think about it. He called again 2 days later. I answered and told him that I was willing to meet, but that I needed him to understand that I was not coming to the table to make anyone comfortable. He said he understood. We arranged lunch for the following Tuesday at a small restaurant that was neutral territory. I told Marcus everything before the lunch. Marcus offered to come. I told him I needed to do this part myself, but that I wanted him to know what I was walking into. He said he would be available by phone the whole time and that he would have his car keys in his hand all afternoon, and I loved him for exactly that. I arrived at the restaurant first. I always arrived first. I had been arriving first my entire life. Gerald came in and sat across from me and looked older than he had looked even at the party. He ordered water and looked at the table and then looked at me and said he wanted to explain himself. I told him he could try. He talked about the night of the party first. He said the words had come out wrong, that he had not meant to be hurtful, that it was the wine and the emotion of the evening and looking out at all those people who had known him for so many years. I listened. I did not interrupt. When he stopped, I asked him whether the words had come out wrong or whether the words were exactly what he had always believed, and he simply forgot to keep them private. He looked at the table. Then he said something I had not expected. He said he knew I had seen the documents. He said my mother had told him after my visit. He looked at me and said that he had done his best with a situation he had not created. He said he had given me a home and an education and a family name and his best effort under difficult circumstances. I asked him whether his best effort had included calling me useful in front of 200 people. He did not answer that directly. And then he said something that revealed everything. He said that he was raising this because there was the matter of his own estate, that he and my mother had been talking about updating their documents, and that given everything that had come to light, he wanted to be transparent about the fact that his estate would naturally be divided between his children, meaning Damien and Priya, and that while I would always be considered family, the legal and biological reality was what it was. He said this in his accountant voice, organized, measured, and emotionally removed. I understood then that this lunch was not about explanation or apology. This lunch was about preparation. Gerald had invited me here to soften the information that was coming, which was that after a lifetime of being in this family, after 32 years of showing up and working hard and earning nothing but a nod, after organizing his retirement party and paying the deposit from my own account and losing sleep over every detail, I was going to be quietly removed from whatever future he was planning for. I looked at my father across the table, and I felt something settle inside me with a finality I had not felt before. Not anger, not grief, something closer to completion. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table between us. Inside the folder were copies of every invoice I had paid for the retirement party. Venue deposit, catering deposit, band booking fee, decorations, photo display production, tribute video editing. Every receipt I had kept, every payment I had made, every vendor invoice with my name on it. The total was $4,386. I had paid for all of it. I had not been reimbursed. I had not asked to be reimbursed because it had never crossed my mind to treat a gift for my father as a business expense. It had crossed my mind now. I also placed in the folder a single printed page that Marcus and I had prepared together after the attorney's consultation. Not a legal filing, not a threat. A clear, calm summary of the timeline, the documents Caroline had sent, the DNA information, the original paternity agreement, and a note that stated that we had retained copies of all materials and had shared the existence of those materials with our attorney for record-keeping purposes. Not to sue anyone. Not to demand anything dramatic. Simply to establish that the documents existed, that I was aware of their contents, and that I intended to handle this situation with my full understanding intact. Gerald looked at the folder, he looked at the invoices, he looked at the printed summary, he looked at me. I told him that I was not asking for anything he was not willing to give. I told him that I was not going to pretend the past 32 years had been different from what they had been. I was not going to pretend that his speech had not happened. I was not going to absorb the cost of his party as a gift to a man who had just publicly announced to 200 people that I was not really his. I told him that the invoice total was not a demand for payment, but an opportunity for him to decide, one final time, what kind of man he intended to be in relation to me. I also told him that I would not be attending further family events where I was expected to perform the role of daughter while being privately categorized as something else. I told him that I wished him good health in his retirement, and that if he wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would need to be honest and equal, or it would need to be nothing, and that both of those outcomes were something. I had come to understand, I could live with. Then I closed the folder and left it on the table, picked up my bag, and walked out of the restaurant. My hands were shaking in the parking lot, not from fear, from the effort of saying true things clearly after a lifetime of not saying them. Marcus picked up on the first ring when I called, and I told him I was okay and asked him to meet me at home. He said he was already on his way. The next few weeks were unsettling. Gerald did not call immediately. My mother called twice, both times with a careful voice that was trying to balance her love for me and her life with Gerald. And I understood that this was an impossible position for her, and I tried to be patient with it, while also being clear that my patience had limits now. I told her that I loved her, and that I was not going to disappear from her life, but that things had changed, and she needed to understand that. The family group chat, which had been quiet since the party, came alive briefly with a message from Damien suggesting a family dinner to clear the air. I did not respond to it. Priya messaged me privately asking if I was going to come to the dinner. I told her I was not available for dinners that were designed to make other people more comfortable at my expense. She did not respond after that. 10 days after the lunch with Gerald, a bank transfer appeared in my account. The full amount, $4,386. The note on the transfer said simply party expenses. No apology, no additional words. Just the number exact to the dollar, which meant he had taken the folder, opened every invoice, added them up carefully, and sent the exact amount. Gerald, the accountant, handling the numbers even when he could not handle the emotion. I stared at that transfer notification for a long time. It was not an apology. It was not love, but it was acknowledgement. It was Gerald, in the only language he had ever truly spoken fluently, saying that I had been right about the cost. Marcus and I talked about everything over the weeks that followed. The conversations were not always easy. Grief came in unexpected waves. There were evenings when I felt the full weight of what I had not had and what I had spent so much energy trying to earn, and those evenings required sitting with the pain honestly rather than explaining it away. Marcus sat with me through those evenings. He did not try to fix them. He understood that some things cannot be fixed and can only be witnessed. I also began a conversation that I had avoided for many years. I found a therapist, a woman named Dr. Osai, who worked with adults navigating complicated family histories. I had put off therapy for a long time because somewhere in me, I had believed that needing help was a form of weakness, which was itself a belief that came directly from being raised in Gerald's house. In the sessions, I started to examine not just the events of the past months, but the much longer pattern, the 32 years of trying to earn something that was never going to be given, and what it had cost me in energy and self-belief, and the quiet background sadness I had grown so accustomed to that I had stopped identifying it as sadness. The conversations with Dr. Osai were slow and important. She did not rush me toward conclusions. She helped me understand that loving a parent who cannot fully love you back is not a flaw in the child. It is a grief, and grief has to be moved through, not around. About 6 weeks after the party, something unexpected happened. A message arrived from a woman named Sylvia, who identified herself as Thomas's daughter, my half-sister. She was 3 years younger than me and lived in a city 4 hours away, and she had grown up knowing her father had another child somewhere whom he had never met. She had spent years wondering. When her father's health had declined the previous year, she had asked him directly whether it was true, and he had confirmed it. She had found me through the same documentation trail that had led Caroline to send the envelope to Marcus. Her message was careful and kind. She said she did not want to intrude. She said she understood if I had no interest in connection. She said she simply wanted me to know that she had thought about me for years, and that if I was ever curious, she was here. I sat with that message for 3 days before I answered it. The idea of a sister who had not been shaped by the same house, the same silence, the same weight, was strange and a little frightening, and also, underneath the fear, something that felt like it might be quietly wonderful. I wrote back. I said I was glad she had reached out. I said I was not ready to rush into anything, but that I was open to a beginning. She wrote back within an hour, and I could feel through the screen that she was smiling. We arranged a phone call for the following week. It lasted 2 hours. Her name was Sylvia, and she had her father's nose and a laugh that reminded me of no one from my childhood, and somehow felt like home anyway. The months that followed were a rearrangement. The family continued in its shape. Gerald and my mother remained together. Damien and Priya continued circling their positions in the family structure. The family dinners happened without me for a while, and I noticed that no one fell apart because of it, which was its own kind of information. My mother and I found our way to a new version of closeness, slower, more honest, with fewer things left unsaid. It was not the same as before. But before had not been fully real. This was real. My event planning business had its best year. I do not think that was a coincidence. When you stop spending enormous invisible amounts of energy managing a relationship that was never going to give you what you needed, that energy goes somewhere else. It went into my work, my marriage, my health, and the slow, careful process of learning what I actually needed from my life now that I was not spending all of it waiting for approval. Marcus and I took a trip. Nothing extravagant. A long weekend by the coast, just the two of us, in a small rented house where we cooked our own meals and walked on the beach every morning and did not talk about family for 2 entire days. On the third morning, I told him that I felt more like myself than I had in years. He said he had been waiting a long time to hear me say that. I think about Gerald sometimes, not with hate, which is something I work to understand rather than simply announce. I do not think hate would serve me. Hate requires the same ongoing energy as love, and I needed that energy for other things now. What I feel when I think about Gerald is something more like clarity. He was a man who agreed to something he was not fully capable of, and rather than grow into it, he spent 32 years maintaining his limitations with extraordinary discipline. That is not a virtue, but it is something I can understand without needing to excuse it. What I cannot excuse, and what I have chosen not to carry alone anymore, is the choice he made at the microphone, in front of 200 people, with a glass of wine and a carefully relaxed expression. That choice was not a slip. That choice was a man who had been holding a private verdict for 32 years and allowed it, in a public moment, to stop being private. And whatever came after that night, whatever transfers or folders or lunches followed, none of it erased the fact that I had heard the truth in the worst possible way, in the worst possible place, at the worst possible moment. But here is what I know now that I did not know before that night. The truth, even when it arrives in the cruelest way, is still the truth. And the truth, once you have it, cannot be taken back. Gerald gave me something that night that he probably did not intend to give me, which was the end of the question. I had spent 32 years asking without knowing I was asking. I had spent 32 years searching a man's face for something that was never going to be there and not understanding why. And then, in the middle of a warmly lit room with a band and catering, and a photo display I had built with my own hands, he gave me the answer. And my husband reached into his jacket pocket and gave me the documents that explained the question. I am Lousia, and I have spent a great deal of my life being useful to people who did not pause to consider whether I was loved. I know the difference now, and I will not confuse the two again. The event planning company is growing. Sylvia and I talk every couple of weeks now, and last month she drove to the city, and we had lunch for the first time and sat across from each other, and saw the things we share and the things we do not, and laughed more than I expected and agreed to do it again. My mother is in my life in a new way that is still finding its shape. Marcus makes tea most evenings, and we sit together, and I have come to understand that ordinary peace is one of the most extraordinary things you can build. I do not need Gerald to be proud of me. I am not sure I ever needed his specific pride. I think what I needed was to believe that I was someone worth being proud of, and I have found that from inside myself now, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. I organized a retirement party for a man who used the word useful in my direction and thought that was enough. I paid for his evening out of my own account and poured 3 months of care into every detail, and stood in that room and felt the full force of what he thought of me. And then I walked back to my life, and I made it better. That is the story, not the one I planned to have, but the one that turned out to be exactly right for where I needed to go. If you are someone who has spent years trying to earn love from a person who already decided how they saw you, I want you to sit with this question in the comments below. How long did you wait be? After you chose yourself, maybe you are still waiting. Maybe you made the choice last week or last year or 20 years ago. Lousia's story belongs to everyone who has ever been called useful by someone who should have called them loved. Leave your thoughts down below, because you are not the only one carrying this, and the people reading these comments might need to know that too.